Hey everyone, Nathan here, Absurd Being. Alright, video 2 of this 5th chapter, Asymmetrical Synthesis of the Sensible. I'm not sure how long this video is going to be. It might end up being a little bit shorter than usual. Usually I'm around 50 minutes. I feel like this is going to come in at about 40. It's just the way that the material kind of breaks up for me as I go through my notes. And yeah, it just took a long time to kind of really get to grips with all of the terminology actually here. We're talking about explication, implication, depth, spatial syntheses, enveloping, developing. There's just a lot of things a lot of balls to keep juggling, balls to keep up in the air at the same time, and just trying to understand the relations between them all takes a little bit of working out. So yeah, I don't know how long this is going to be. We'll see when we get to the end. So the first section anyway today is explication, implication. So you remember in the last video, right at the very end, we talked about the paradox of the paradox of how we can think difference. And we said that difference was inexplicable, and there was nothing strange about that. Difference is kind of, it's always behind our explanations. It can never be fully and completely explained because there's always this kind of remainder. It's the source of your explanations. Any explanation is kind of grounded in difference. It's working through difference already. So it's, in a sense, difference is like always behind you. You never get around to be able to see it, to grasp it explicitly. So it's inexplicable. No problems with that. But here we see that Deleuze is actually going in a slightly different direction with the word inexplicable. Or maybe he's adding a direction, adding a layer to that understanding. I'll give you a quote which I think will point us in the right direction, and then we'll break the quote down. Difference is explicated, but in systems in which it tends to be cancelled. This means only that difference is essentially implicated, that its being is implication. It is cancelled in extensity and in the quality which fills that extensity. However, difference creates both this extensity and this quality. Difference in the form of intensity remains implicated in itself, while it is cancelled by being explicated in extensity. Now that is kind of a mouthful to get around, and if you read that without any kind of context or any deeper engagement with Deleuze, I think you'd come away thinking Deleuze is talking nonsense. This is all rubbish. It's kind of the same with Heidegger. You know, if you can people take passages from Heidegger where he talks about being and beingness and the being of the being, blah blah blah, and just write it off as gibberish. But when you get into it, when you actually delve into it, you immerse yourself in the material. These passages actually make sense, and but you don't get that without putting in without investing a little bit of time to get that context, to understand what it is that's actually going on here. But anyway. So there is some sense to that, and we're going to break it down now. So difference is explicated. When Deleuze uses that word explicate, what he means now, we've kind of shifted a little bit. So we talked about the difference being inexplicable in the sense that it could never be directly, certainly grasped, if you like, or understood, because there's always this remainder behind you which is driving that explanation itself. But now, so that's more like an epistemological sense of explication, right? Now we're kind of moving into what I would say is a metaphysical way of understanding explication. So explication here as more like developed, or if we're thinking about difference as that metaphysical bedrock, it's the way that difference, as those relations within the idea, are actualized, the way that they are, the way that they emerge as concrete realities. And that's what explicate means here, to take something which has no concrete sensibility and actualize it in space and time. And so we have this idea of extensity, explicate into extensity, into qualities, extensity and qualities. So anyway, that's metaphysical. Difference is explicated. Explication takes on this metaphysical hue. But it's explicated in systems in which it tends to be cancelled. So we know this already. We've talked about the way that difference always, when it finally actualizes as a concrete reality, the difference is no longer apparent or visible. I hesitate to use the word, but hidden, if you like. It's no longer obvious. Instead, all that's obvious is the extension, the intensity, or the difference that was our origin, that was our origin, our starting point, our genesis, is covered over. So it tends to be cancelled, and this is kind of important here. What this means then is that difference is essentially implicated. And this word then, implicated, I think we can take the normal meaning of the word, which is to be involved in something but without kind of direct evidence of that involvement. So difference is it's the source, it's the genesis, but its very essence is to not appear as the source or the genesis, to be covered over by extensity. So when difference is explicated, it's always implicated. Or difference, maybe a better way to put this is, difference is always implicated. It's never apparent in its role as source, in its role as the genesis of actualization. So when he says difference is essentially implicated, that's what he means. He means the essence of difference is to be implicated only, not to be apparent, not to be obvious in its role, in what it's doing as the source of extension. And that's what he means when he says its being is implication. Its being is that never apparent, never obviously involved force, if you like. Its being is to never be given. That would be maybe another way to think about this. So it's cancelled. How is it cancelled? It's cancelled in extensity, which is basically space, and quality. And we talked about those, the two different forms of quality in the last video, primary and the secondary qualities. So just the regular philosophical primary and secondary qualities, extension, things like motion, size, those kinds of things, and the secondary qualities, things that we can sense, the perceptible qualities. What else do we have there? In the last sentence I wanted to emphasize as well, difference in the form of intensity remains implicated in itself while it is cancelled by being explicated in extensity. Really important that makes sense to you, because all of those terms are going to be crucial for the next for the rest of this chapter, and we're going to springboard into other terms as well, which will require a full which will require that you be comfortable with this kind of language. So difference in the form of intensity, which we've seen as difference. Difference is intensity, or it's a tautology to say the intensity of difference, right? Because they're so intertwined, those two notions. Difference in the form of intensity remains implicated in itself. It's always implicated. It's always in the background. It's always covered over. It's never apparent, never obvious, never fully revealed. And it's cancelled by being explicated in extensity. So when difference is explicated, when it becomes a concrete reality, then as we've seen, it's by necessity always cancelled. And quality then, in this case, so quality as part of that extension, part of that explication, quality is a sign, Deleuze says, referring to an implicated order of constitutive differences. So it's a sign indicating, referring us back to this this original source, this implication of difference, if we know to look for it. And that's what the whole book's about, really, is outlining this source, which is always covered over and usually therefore missed by commentators. And all of this means then that difference, although being cancelled, has never ceased to be in itself, to be implicated in itself, even while it is explicated outside itself. And why is this important? Why are we discussing this? Deleuze brings this back to entropy, which we talked about a little bit in the last video with regard to thermodynamics. And here Deleuze just gets a little bit more detailed about how he's connecting this to entropy. And it's good. It's definitely worth going through. So we'll have a look at it. Entropy is the tendency, essentially the tendency of disorder to increase. And one of the problems with this, though, is understanding then where the original order comes from. How can it be that there's this reservoir, if you like, of order, which then can disintegrate or deteriorate into disorder? So this is one of the problems with that physics tries to address. The problem of entropy is how is it that the universe was originally so perfectly ordered that it can then deteriorate into disorder from there? And the problem with this is that the problem is ill-defined. This talking about the problem of an original order and trying to understand the tendency of the universe to disorder is ill-defined. And how is it ill-defined? When it's thought according to extension. So when we think from, to use a word that Deleuze doesn't use, but from the plane of extensity. If you think from the level of space, basically, then you'll never make sense of entropy. That's kind of the idea. So why is this way of framing the problem a problem? Why is it ill-defined? And the reason is that order and disorder. So, and I'm veering a little bit off Deleuze here, I think, but I think we'll come back to him in our conclusion. So the reason is that order and disorder depend on a perspective, right? There's no way you can meaningfully talk about a system being ordered or disordered or tending from one to the other without some kind of privileged perspective. And one way that this is often described, entropy is often explained, is through the use of a pack of cards. And if you have a completely ordered set of playing cards, its entropy is low because it's perfectly ordered. And there's only one way for the pack of cards to be perfectly ordered like that. But any other random arrangement of cards is then a movement away from that order, a movement into disorder. And the idea is that there are many more ways for the pack of cards to be disordered, to be randomly arranged, than there are for it to be ordered, which is, and there's only one way which that pack of cards can be perfectly ordered. But the problem is, right, that depends on someone recognizing that there is an order, that the order goes from ace 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 down to jack, queen, king, and broken up by the different suits. I mean, that requires a perspective. There's meaning in that, but meaning given to the pack of cards by an outside perspective. Without that outside perspective, every arrangement of the playing cards is as unique and original and ordered as any other. So I've always felt that there's this problem with the way that entropy has been framed, with this ordering and disordering, and the tendency then from the former to the latter, the tendency to disorder. Someone actually asked, if you know Sean Carroll, he's a kind of popular theoretical physicist. He has a podcast, and I listened when I was in my podcast phase. I listened to someone call him and she asked him about that exact thing, that order only makes sense from, I forget the words she used, but from a perspective, from an outside subject looking in, imposing meaning onto the system. And he gave a really bad answer, I thought. In fact, he didn't even answer it. And Sean Carroll is usually pretty on the money. He's pretty clear with what he knows his subject really well, and he's usually quite concise and clear, I've found, in his explanations. But he really struggled with that, and I think it goes right to the heart of the problem of entropy. However, if we think entropy in terms of intensity, in terms of difference, then it makes sense to talk of order and disorder, because there is a perspective of sorts in the difference of intensity. Right? If we already have intensity, if there's already difference built into the system as a kind of foundation, then there is a sense in which we can talk about order and disorder, because we have these points of these unequal points, these points in which there can be a relation between them. So we get this we get a kind of perspective from which we can describe the system in terms of order and disorder. And secondly, or B, the order as difference is built into the universe. It's we're describing metaphysical bedrock as difference, as this original order. So we don't then have to explain it. The order as difference, implicated difference, which can then be explicated in extensity, is already the picture that we have, that we're starting with. So there is no reservoir of order which needs to be explained, because the difference is that order. But it's not something which was highly in a kind of pristine state at the beginning, and then since then has been deteriorating into disorder. Rather, it's that the state of order at the beginning is difference, is this fundamental relation between terms, between elements within the idea. And then when it gets explicated, that's that movement towards disorder, which is really the cancellation of difference. So it's kind of like I say, a reframing of the picture of entropy from an extensive way of thinking in terms of order and disorder to an intensive way of thinking grounded in difference, where we the movement goes from full, complete difference to cancelled difference. And that, then when we shift our thinking from the first level to the second, from the level of extensity to intensity, then entropy makes sense. Then this problem disappears. This problem of where the original order comes from disappears. It just becomes a non-problem once we change the way that we think about this. And I think this quote supports that conclusion, or that way of how I've interpreted Deleuze on this anyway. He says, entropy is an extensive factor, but it is an extension or explication which is implicated as such in intensity, which does not exist outside the implication or except as implicated. And interestingly enough, this is almost exactly what Bergson has to say about entropy as well. He says the only difference, or there are two differences actually, but Bergson says entropy can't be understood on the plane of space, whereas Deleuze uses the word extension. And for Bergson, in order to understand entropy, we have to change our way of thinking to duration. And for Deleuze, he wants us to move to difference, intensity. But it's the same move. Deleuze is making the same move as Bergson, just instead of going from space to duration, he's going from extension to intensity or difference. But I thought that was interesting. And Deleuze then calls this a transcendental illusion. The illusion being that entropy is extensive only and can only be understood through extension. If we can get around that, if we can overcome that illusion, see entropy, understand entropy from the right, on the right plane, on the right level as intensity, then the problems dissolve. Okay, so this brings us to the second part of the video, which is depth. So we've been talking about extensity and intensity. Now, Deleuze notes that extensity cannot account for the individuations which occur within it. And he highlights these three, what he calls individuation factors: the high and the low, right and left, and figure and ground. So extensity cannot account for those. Why? The reason is that as features of an already developed extensity, they are only relative. They only have, again, on that level of extensity itself, if that's your approach here, if that's how you're trying to understand these individuation factors, then they only appear as relative. They have no deeper significance, no deeper meaning. They have, in fact, no explanation. And that's what we're looking for here. We're trying to explain these things. We're trying to explain space, extension, quality. But you'll never do that on the plane of extension, because the magic, if you like, has already happened. You've already missed it. And so when you talk about these things, high, low, right, left, figure, and ground, on that level, on that, again, and this is the Bergsonian word, plane, on the plane of space, on the plane of extension, they are nothing more than relative. They have no, there's no intrinsic meaning to them. For an explanation, we need to go deeper to, in fact, Deleuze says, depth itself. And depth itself is not an extension, but a pure implex. That's the word he uses, implex. So connecting us to the idea of implication again. Implication, intensity, difference, all of these terms are they synonyms? They're close to, if they're not exact synonyms, they're very close to synonyms. So we're talking about then the depth that we're talking about is a depth which has nothing to do with the empirical relations between empirical objects in extensity already. It's a depth which is beyond the level of extension and in this level of implication, of difference. It's a depth as pure implex. So depth then is, again, Deleuze gives another idea of how we should think of depth. Depth is an ultimate and original heterogeneity, which means then, as I've already indicated, that it's on the side of difference or intensity. If it's not an exact synonym for those terms, it's close to. And it means that it's the source of extensity. And as the source, then it is like difference and intensity, it's covered over or implicated. So just trying to think about this, how depth and intensity are related. Deleuze says that these two things are actually the same at the level of being. So he says that depth is intensity of being, or vice versa. And the vice versa, you would imagine, would be that intensity is depth of being. So again, the relation is so close between these two as to be really kind of, the way that I think about it is depth and intensity are like two ways of grasping the same thing, two ways of understanding the same thing with different words that carry different connotations, which allow for different understandings of what this fundamental thing is, depth or intensity, or difference in fact. So depth is intensity of being, intensity is depth of being. They are essentially the same thing, but grasped from two different perspectives. Are those two words just kind of revealing the thing, difference, revealing it in different ways, giving it a different sense, so we can have a fuller understanding of what it is. And I think depth, so intensity acts as a point of reference to extensity. So when we think of this difference in terms of intensity, we get that picture between intensity and extensity. And when we think of depth, we get this sense of the source of extensity, that which gives us an explanation, literally a deeper grasp, a deeper understanding of the phenomenon, and also puts us in touch with how difference is explicated in extensity as acquiring sensible depth, concrete depth that we perceive. So I think that those two words just reveal difference, essentially, or depth / intensity, or whatever word we want to use here, but they reveal it in different ways that give us a fuller understanding of it. And he also says that these extensive dimensions, the high, low, right, left, figure, and ground, are dissymmetrical marks of their own origin. So they're dissymmetrical marks of their own origin. How are they dissymmetrical? First, they are completely opposite, right? Figure and ground, they're moving in completely different directions, right and left. Although a thing can be symmetrical about its right and left dimensions, right and left itself are completely dissymmetrical. They're complete opposites. And the same with high and low. That's how I understand this anyway, dissymmetrical. And this would connect to the title of the chapter, right? So just keep in mind the overall arc of what Deleuze is trying to explain here, the asymmetrical synthesis of the sensible. So this gives us some insight into what he's aiming for here. And so that's how they're dissymmetrical, how they're asymmetrical, but they're marks of their own origin. What does that mean? So maybe instead of the word mark, sign would be a better word, or one that we've already used. Signs of their own origin. They point to their origin. And he talks about the law of figure and ground. So from the level of extensity, I've used that word before, level, from the plane of extensity, but I don't want to open myself to misinterpretation here, talking about planes of reality. That's definitely not what I'm getting at, but maybe different ways of understanding reality. You can understand reality through extensity alone, which is what science does, or you can look to understand how extensity arises. But in order to do that, obviously you have to go beyond extensity, not to magic, not to mysticism, religion. That option's there if you want it. But we can also go to the metaphysical, which doesn't make these kinds of leaps, what I would call wildly speculative leaps based on very little evidence. But metaphysics keeps us grounded in something. We're not indulging in flights of fancy, but we're just trying to explain in the best way, in the most and when I say best way, we're trying to explain the concrete, we're trying to explain extensity without having to make any leaps of faith which then need to be explained. We're trying to explain something, we're trying to explain extensity in a way in which the explanation is not more outrageous than the very thing we're explaining. So we want something basic, we want something simple, we want something fundamental. We don't want something more complicated that would seem to imply there needs to be another explanation behind that. It's kind of how I think of metaphysics, actually, as trying to understand, trying to explain the reality that we know and love, extension, and well, time, I guess, but the sensible realm, but with appeal to something that is more basic, something that can then be truly understood as foundational, that doesn't then need an extra explanation because it is itself so complex that it requires one. So trying to explain something complex, the world that we live in, with something simple, with something that can be understood as basic and foundational. Anyway, so the law of figure and ground. In extensity, we can't explain this. It's because that's where it happens. Extensity, the law of figure and ground takes place in extensity. We can't appeal to extensity to explain it. And I see two options here, two ways to think about proceeding from here. The first would be a phenomenological approach, which is a description, not an explanation. And here, figure and ground makes sense. They're meaningful because they're imposed on reality, on this extensity, which has no meaning in itself, but they're imposed on that by a subject. So they have meaning. Figure and ground then, while they don't have meaning in and of themselves, they acquire meaning through the perspective of a subject. That's the first way you can go. The second way is this metaphysical approach, which Deleuze is taking, and this gives you an explanation, not just a description. And here we're talking about depth as the source, or in Deleuze's words, the object itself entertaining a relation to its own depth. So even without requiring a subject, because we're understanding reality itself, metaphysical reality, metaphysical bedrock as difference, then all of these other ways of understanding that come in. Intensity is naturally a part of difference. So is depth, because it's the same thing. It's that relation between these different terms, or these terms which are difference, which arise from that difference itself, and it's those which are explicated. And so that this just gives us, like I said before when we were talking about entropy, it gives us a perspective, if you like, without an actual subject to take a perspective on it. Difference, if we understand reality as difference, then we get this possibility for relation, for intensity, for depth that doesn't require a subject. So the object can entertain a relation to its own depth, because we're beneath the level of subjects. We're trying to understand the reality from which subjects come into being in the first place. And this, I think, if we think in terms of difference, we can do that. And both of those approaches, by the way, are perfectly valid. This is one thing that I think people sometimes don't understand, especially people who criticize phenomenology. They're criticizing it. I think I might have said this before. They're criticizing it as a metaphysics, as a metaphysical theory. That is to say, they're criticizing it as an explanation of reality. But that's not what it is. Phenomenology is a description. Israel never said he was doing anything other than describing experience, describing those immediate things that are immediately given to us. That's what phenomenology is about. And none of the phenomenologists, except maybe Merleau-Ponty, I feel like he kind of blurs the distinction between metaphysics and phenomenology. I think he comes up the worst for it. Anyway, don't get me started on that. Well, if I ever get to a video series on the visible and the invisible, the visible and the invisible, we will we'll look at that in more detail. But yeah, both of these approaches are fine because they're dealing with they're approaching reality from different directions. But yeah. All right, third section, spatial syntheses. Now, this is going to be a very short section, but basically there are just three spatial syntheses that Deleuze mentions, and these, he says, repeat the temporal syntheses that we've already looked at. So the explication of extensity rests upon the first synthesis, that of habit or the present. The implication of depth rests upon the second synthesis, that of memory and the past. And finally, in depth, the proximity and simmering of the third synthesis make themselves felt, announcing the universal ungrounding. And that are the three spatial syntheses mapping onto the three temporal syntheses. But it's really strange that that's all he says about these. Like he doesn't go into, think about the depth, the level of explanation that we went into talking about the temporal syntheses, and then we come to these spatial syntheses, and it's like 3 sentences, and that's it. So there's really nothing more to say here, but there is a lot more to say. But Deleuze doesn't say anything about it because, well, I don't know why he doesn't, but this is just completely passed over, how these spatial syntheses are connected, or how they repeat the temporal syntheses. And that's also a very Bergsonian thing. Space is very much underrepresented in Bergson. It's like it's not the real. It doesn't get to that metaphysical reality, which for Bergson is duration. It's all about duration, and space is the complete opposite of that. It's the abstract way of understanding reality. It's moving away from what reality really is, which is duration. And so it's not quite as bad as that in Deleuze, because we are talking a lot about space and how space arises. But just this little section, these 3 spatial syntheses, if you blink while you're reading, you miss it. But it's there anyway, so I've included it. But that's all he says about it. So we'll move into the last section, which is the pure spatium. All right, so where are we? Extensity is extensive magnitude, extensive quantity, and this is basically empirical space. Depth, on the other hand, is Deleuze says space as a whole. So it's the source of this extensive magnitude, empirical space. And it's space understood as an intensive quantity. And this is what Deleuze calls the pure spatium. So just another term to keep in mind, pure spatium. When he uses that, he's talking about space not as the space that we experience, but space as depth, as intensive quantity, out of which empirical space is explicated. And what's important, I think, there is that word, that term, intensive quantity. And it's important because, again, in the way that I said before, talking about depth and intensity and difference, these 3 words that are essentially synonyms, they give us a different sense of the thing. They give us a different way of understanding difference. They kind of open up new meanings for us that maybe we didn't see prior to this new label. And I think that's what's happening here with intensive quantity. So this gives us an understanding of depth or difference or intensity in relation to extensive quantity. And if you keep that pairing in mind, then we're kind of on the right track when we use the word intense, the term intensive quantity. So what does it mean then? Because usually we think of intensity as lacking quantities, as not being describable as quantity. It's a quality, right? It's an experienced phenomenon. But if we understand intensive quantity as being, if we understand that word intensive connected to intensity, then we understand that this is a part of difference. So what we're talking about is a quantity that is grounded in or based in difference. And now it starts to make a little bit more sense, because we can see that in difference we have these relations between different elements. And we can kind of think of those relations in quantifiable terms, as quantities, even though they're not going to be measurable, they're not going to be precise in the same way that extensive quantities can be. But it still makes sense to understand them as quantities and not qualities. And we're going to see a little bit later, we can even talk about the word distance in the same way. Distance not as in an empirical sense, in extensity, but distance as in intensity, as in the distance between the different elements. We can think of the relations between elements in the idea as having distance. And so these words, they make sense, they have meaning when understood within this framework of difference, which is the linchpin of the whole book. So, with that under our belts, there are basically two questions in this section that I want to address. The first is, what is space? And the quote is that space as pure intuition or spatium is an intensive quantity, and intensity as a transcendental principle is not merely the anticipation of perception, but the source of a quadruple genesis, that of the extensio in the form of schema, that of extensity in the form of extensive magnitude, extensum, that of qualitas in the form of matter occupying extensity, and that of the quale in the form of designation of an object. So, what is space? Space is this spatium, pure intuition, again, just terms to be familiar with. It's an intensive quantity. And intensity is transcendental principle. So the words transcendental and metaphysical, they overlap quite significantly, because remember, transcendental we described as with reference to an encounter, something which causes something to arise. And essentially that overlaps here when we're talking about metaphysics, which is that fundamental nature of reality. So there are places where they diverge, but there are places where they come together. And so I think don't get thrown by that. But it's the source of a quadruple genesis. So extensio, which I take, so he says it's a form of schema. I take this to be the abstract, mathematized understanding of space. Extensum, which is extensity in the form of extensive magnitude, extensive quantities. Then qualitas, which we've talked about before, matter occupying space. And quale, which is the designation of an object, the secondary qualities. And that's what space is. Space understood not as at the level of extension, but space understood at the level of intensity, at depth of depth. Essentially, it is, and we'll talk about this more in videos to come, essentially space is the capacity to facilitate in extensity the actualization of ideal connections, i.e. those differential relations in the idea. And that's where we're going to circle back to. This whole discussion about extensity is ultimately grounded in the actualization of the idea, or the differential relations in the idea anyway. So that's what space is. The second question is, how does space develop? And the quote sounds like this: intensity, which envelops distances, is explicated in extensity, while extensity develops, exteriorizes, and homogenizes these very distances. At the same time, a quality occupies this extensity, either in the form of a qualitas, which defines the milieu of a direction, or in the form of a quale, which characterizes a given object in relation to that direction. I think this is a really nice quote. I think everything kind of comes in together smoothly here. Intensity is explicated in extensity. We've talked about that in some detail. Intensity envelops distances. Now, this is another important word, envelop. And it takes a while just to get your head around what this might mean. Envelop as in like surrounding or enclosing. And distances as, and this is where what I talked about before, distances not as in empirical distances, but distance as relation between heterogeneous terms. Distance as a relation between different terms. So distance understood at the level of difference. Hence, this gives us our connection to intensity, the way that the difference that arises between two terms, or the relation that arises between two terms, gives us our connection to intensity. The connection can be more or less intense in relation to this distance that separates the terms. But again, not physical distance, not distance and extension. This is distance on the side of intensity, of difference. So intensity envelops distances. How else could you say that? It wraps them up. It gathers them together. It holds them as such. It makes them something. It turns them into something which we can then work with. So intensity envelops distances like this. It gathers them up, and then at the same time that this happens, extensity develops, exteriorizes, and homogenizes those distances. So again, understood at the level of difference, it cancels the differences, tending to uniformity and allowing the relation between those terms to manifest, to what's the word I'm looking for? Explicate in extensity. So it's just kind of like crossing that boundary from the insensible difference to sensible extensity. And this is what we're talking about here, is moving from the idea to concrete realities, right? To actualization. We're talking about the process of actualization. And actualization happens in space and time. So space and time, or actualization, perhaps a better way to put this, actualization is the spacing and the timing of the idea as it is, as it becomes a concrete reality, as it actualizes into a concrete reality. So it's just, and again, the way to understand it is through that pairing of terms, envelop and develop, the way that they operate together. Intensity envelops distances, extensity develops those distances into extension, into the empirical space. So in a sense, it's like maybe talking about it is an intensive space and an extensive space, moving from the intensive space into the idea where terms are related to each other, heterogeneous terms are related to each other, and difference is full, to this concrete empirical reality where everything is, where those distances, those relations between the terms become something concrete, become actualized, and difference is cancelled. And that's basically all this is describing, but it's good. It's going to be important to get comfortable with those terms, envelop and develop. And extensity, what else do we have? Extensity is occupied by quality. And again, those two forms of quality come up here, qualitas and quale, primary and secondary qualities, if you like. But I quite like the way Deleuze describes them here. Qualitas as the milieu of a direction. So it feels a little bit like kind of form, although it's always risky to use that word, but feels a little bit formish. And then quale as that which characterizes a given object in relation to that direction. So this is the perceptible, this is giving that form that has no meat on its bones, giving it a felt, perceptible quality. And all of this means that intensity is simultaneously the imperceptible and that which can only be perceived, Deleuze says. And how can we make sense of this? It can't be sensed for itself because it's only explicated in the qualities which cover it and the extensity in which it is distributed. So it can't be sensed for itself because it's always, its being is to be implicated. It's always cancelled when it's explicated. But it can only be sensed in the sense that it is what gives things to be sensed and defines the proper limits of sensibility itself. So to the extent that we can grasp it at all, it's only through sense, only through what it is once it is actualized. And then we can, if we approach it in the right way, we can see it as a sign. Deleuze talks about it as a sign indicating this deeper source. In other words, Deleuze says intensity cannot be sensed from the point of view of the empirical, but can only be sensed from the point of view of the transcendent. And that seems like as good a place as any to hit a summary. So first up, explication and implication. Here the idea is that difference is explicated in empirical systems, or extensive in extensity and extension. And the word here really is one way to think about this as being developed. Explicated means developed in that metaphysical sense. Deleuze might use the word transcendental here, but the same thing, developed in extensity. And when it is developed in extensity, when it is explicated, it's always cancelled. We've seen that, we talked about that in many different parts of this series. Difference is essentially implicated in itself. So difference, its being is implication. Its being is to be in the background, to never be explicitly apparent. Its being is to be that hidden source, which in order to be the source must be hidden, must be concealed, must remain concealed. And we also looked at entropy in this section, and the basic takeaway is that entropy can only be understood as intensity, not extensity. The second part of the video was depth. We talked about depth as a pure implex, and the idea here is that depth is on the side of difference or intensity. It's another way of talking about it. It's another way of grasping this. It's a way that highlights difference or intensity in a different way. It highlights a different aspect, if you like, to difference. And depth being on the side of difference or intensity is the origin of extensity. The third section was the spatial syntheses. There were 3 of these, and we saw how they connect. We didn't see actually, but we were told that they repeat the temporal syntheses. So the first one was the explication of extensity, and this repeats the first temporal synthesis of habit or the present. Then the second one was the implication of depth, and this repeats the second temporal synthesis of memory and the past. And then the third was the universal ungrounding, which is the third temporal synthesis, but again, there's no real detail provided there. And the last section was the pure spatium, and I gave 2 questions here. The first was, what is space? And the answer is, space is an intensive quantity, so a quantity based in difference. Understanding that word quantity in terms of in terms of metaphysics, right? In terms of the idea, in terms of the relations between those heterogeneous terms. And space is the genesis of those 4, it's that quadruple genesis that Deleuze talked about, the genesis of extensio, extensum, qualitas, and quale. And basically what space is, as we're describing it here, is that which facilitates the actualization of differential relations in the idea, i.e. it actualizes them in extensity. And this is an idea we'll come back to in later videos. The second question was, how does space develop? And the answer here, intensity, depth, space, is explicated in extensity. And another pairing of terms arose here for us in envelop and develop. So intensity envelops distances as extensity develops distances. So intensity envelops or relates distance as the difference between different terms, heterogeneous terms in the idea, and extensity develops those distances into extensity, into extension. And hopefully that has clarified something about this section. There are a lot of new terms to come to grips with in this, and it took me a lot of reading and rereading, and I find you just have to spend time with these authors, with these texts, just rereading sections and like ad nauseum almost, and then things start kind of falling into place once you've had some time to mull over these different ideas and the relations and the different ways they're connected. But anyway, that's where I'm going to leave it today. Thanks for watching, and we'll see you in the next one.